There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man who has just finished building a dream. And in the summer of 1955, that quiet belonged to Walt Disney. Disneyland had opened its gates in Anaheim, California, and the crowds had come, and the cameras had rolled, and the tickets had been torn by white-gloved hands at the entrance to Main Street, USA. But even as the fireworks settled over the Matterhorn's future silhouette, even as the last guests wander home through parking lots still smelling of fresh asphalt, something in Walt's mind had already moved on. He had built a park. What he wanted now in the slow and patient corridors of his imagination was something far larger, far stranger, and far more permanent. He wanted to build this city. It is worth sitting with that thought for a moment, letting it settle the way lamplight settles over a drafting table late at night. Disneyland, for all its wonder, was bound by fences. It was a park you visited and then left, a beautiful enclosure surrounded by the ordinary sprawl of post-war Southern California. The motels and the billboards and the citrus groves slowly giving way to asphalt. Walt watched that sprawl creep toward his gates in the years after opening day, watched the cheap signage and the tourist traps multiply along the boulevards leading to his kingdom, and he felt something between disappointment and resolve. If he built again, he told the people closest to him, he would control everything, not just the park itself, but the land around it, stretching for miles in every direction. A buffer of green and quiet that no bypass motel could ever touch. This was the seed from which Progress City would grow, though it would take Walt nearly a decade of quiet thought, quiet travel, and quiet acquisition before the idea found its true shape. He was not, in this period, a man given to grand public announcements. He worked away in architect works, in sketches and models, and long conversations held after the office had emptied out. The fluorescent lights humming over drafting tables where W.D. Enterprises, his newly formed Imagineering arm, began to give form to something that did not yet have a name. He traveled to World's Fairs. He studied the pavilions of General Motors and the sweeping ambition of their Futurama exhibit, the one that had captivated an entire generation in 1939 with its vision of highways unspooling toward a gleaming horizon. He thought about cities the way an urban planner thinks about them, but he thought about them also the way a filmmaker thinks about a set, as spaces that could be designed frame by frame, moment by moment, to produce a feeling. And the feeling he wanted, more than anything else, was order. Walt had grown up watching cities that seemed to sprawl without intention, streets laid down by accident and expanded by necessity, traffic tangled at intersections never meant to hold so many automobiles. He believed, with the quiet conviction of a man who had spent his life solving visual problems, that a city could be different if someone simply sat down and designed it properly from the very beginning, the way he had designed the layout of Disneyland itself, radiating outward from a central hub so that a guest standing at the foot of the castle could see, in a single unhurried glance, every land that awaited him. Why should a city not work the same way? Why should the great unsolved problems of American urban life, the traffic, the pollution, the crowding, the decay of downtown cores, not yield to the same patient, geometric thinking that had turned a bean field in Anaheim into the happiest place on earth? The land search that followed was conducted with the hush of a covert operation, and there is something almost dreamlike in imagining it now. Small teams of men in dark suits moving quietly through the citrus groves and cattle pastures of Central Florida, careful never to mention the name Disney, careful never to let a landowner guess what future lay folded inside their unassuming offers. Florida offered what California no longer could, which was distance from prying eyes and enough empty, undervalued land to make Walt's buffer zone a reality many times over. beginning in 1963 and continuing through the following year. The acquisitions proceeded parcel by quiet parcel, through dummy corporations with names like I4 Corporation and Latin American Development and Management Company, names chosen specifically to reveal nothing, until Walt Disney Productions had assembled a holding of land nearly twice the size of the island of Manhattan, resting low and green and swampy in the heart of Orange and Osceola counties, threaded through, with slow-moving creeks and stands of cypress that had stood undisturbed for generations. When the truth was finally revealed, in the autumn of 1965, standing beside Florida's governor in a Winter Park Hotel ballroom, Walt did not speak first about a theme park. He spoke about a city. He described in that warm and unhurried voice so many Americans already knew from their television screens on Sunday evenings, a place he called EPCOT, an acronym standing for the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, though the word experimental was doing a great deal of quiet work in that title. Because what Walt envisioned was not experimental in the sense of tentative or provisional, but experimental in the sense of a living laboratory, a place that would never be finished, never be complete, because completion itself was contrary to the very idea of progress. Picture, then, the city as Walt described, and as his designers began to render it on canvas and in scale model. A vast circle laid gently across the reclaimed Florida land, its structure radiating outward from a covered, climate-controlled core the way spokes radiate from the hub of a great wheel. At the absolute center stood what the plans called the hub, a soaring, glass-domed structure rising some 30 stories into the humid Florida air, its curved skin catching the sunlight in the daytime and glowing softly from within after dark. A beacon visible for miles across the flat green landscape surrounding it. Beneath that dome would live the commercial heart of the city, hotels and shops and convention spaces arranged across multiple levels. All of it sheltered from rain and heat and the biting insects of the Florida wetlands by a canopy of glass and steel that transformed the unpredictable outdoors into something permanently, dependably pleasant. Below this shimmering core, and this is where Walt's thinking became most radical, most quietly revolutionary. The city would be built in layers, stacked one atop another like the floors of a building laid sideways across the earth. The topmost level, the one pedestrians would actually walk upon, would belong entirely to people. No automobiles would intrude upon it at all. Wide plazas and covered walkways would connect the residential neighborhoods to the central hub, shaded by trees and cooled by fountains. A landscape designed for wandering rather than driving, for the unhurried rhythm of a person on foot with nowhere urgent to be. One level below that pedestrian plane, hidden from view entirely, service vehicles and delivery trucks would move through their own dedicated tunnels, keeping the noise and exhaust and clutter of commerce completely separate from the experience of daily life above. And beneath even that, a third level, deeper still, would carry the true circulatory system of the city, its power lines and water mains and communication cables running in clean, accessible channels that maintenance crews could reach without ever disturbing the world above them. It was a city imagined in cross-section, the way a geologist imagines the strata of the earth, each layer serving its purpose without ever touching the others, radiating outward from this stacked and gleaming center, along wide green corridors of parkland. The residential neighborhoods of Progress City would unfold in a pattern of gentle, deliberate variety. Low-density suburban-style homes giving way gradually to higher-density apartment towers as one moved inward toward the hub, so that a resident could choose, at any stage of life, precisely the kind of dwelling that suited them and could move inward or outward as their needs changed without ever needing to leave the community they called home. Walt spoke of this with genuine tenderness in his voice, describing elderly residents who might wish to live closer to the conveniences of the center, and young families who might prefer a quiet house with a lawn near the edges, all of them bound together by the same transportation system, the same schools, the same sense of shared civic purpose. And it was the transportation system, more than any single building, that Walt lingered over longest in his descriptions, because it was here that the true elegance of Progress City would reveal itself. Gliding silently along elevated concrete beams, their pastel color cars moving with a hush that seemed almost impossible for something so large. The monorails would connect the residential rings to the central hub and eventually to a nearby industrial park and international airport, carrying commuters and visitors alike without a single drop of gasoline burned, without a single exhaust pipe releasing its haze into the soft Florida sky. Walt had already tested this technology, of course, watching the all-wag monorail circle Disneyland's Tomorrowland since 1959, and he had come to believe, with the quiet certainty of a man who trusts what he has seen with his own eyes, that this was not a novelty ride, but the genuine future of urban movement, smooth and quiet and entirely free of the traffic that strangled so many American downtowns. Within the covered hub itself, and within the denser residential rings closest to the center, a second and even gentler system would carry people to shorter distances, a network the designers called the People Mover, its small open cars threading along elevated tracks at a leisurely, unhurried pace, powered by a series of rotating rubber tires embedded in the track itself, rather than by any engine housed within the cars, so that the vehicles could glide forward in near total silence, humming faintly as they carried their passengers past shop windows and beneath the vast glass canopy overhead, curving gently around corners with none of the lurching and screeching so familiar to riders of conventional trains. One could imagine standing at the base of the great glass dome and looking upward, watching these pale, softly lit cars drift past one another on parallel tracks, crossing and merging with the calm precision of a mechanism designed not merely to function but to soothe, to reassure every passenger that here, at last, was a city where motion itself had been made peaceful. Walt would not live to see any of it built. In the closing weeks of 1966, in a hospital room not far from the studio where so many of his dreams had first taken shape on paper, he continued sketching the layout of Progress City on the ceiling tiles above his bed, tracing with his finger the radial pattern of the hub and the rings, the highways and the monorail beams, the green belts of parkland separating one neighborhood from the next, as though by sheer act of visualization he might yet will the whole shimmering structure into being. He died in December of that year, and with him died the particular, singular vision of an actual functioning city, populated by actual permanent residents, governed under actual experimental policies free from the normal constraints of municipal law. What his successors would eventually build upon, that same reclaimed Florida swampland, would carry his city's name and borrow deeply from its aesthetic, its optimism, its love of geometry and glass and silent motion. But it would become something gentler and more contained, a permanent World's Fair rather than a living city, a place to visit rather than a place to dwell. And yet, in the quiet architecture of that eventual creation, in every curved pathway and every softly gliding vehicle, the ghost of Progress City would remain patient and unhurried, exactly as Walt had first imagined it, drifting forever just beneath the surface of the park that finally rose in its place. In the years that followed Walt Disney's passing, there settled over his company a particular kind of silence, not the silence of inactivity, but the silence of people uncertain how to proceed without the one voice that had always, in the end, made the final decision. Roy O. Disney, Walt's older brother, stepped forward in this period to see through the completion of the Florida project that would become the Magic Kingdom, understanding that whatever else might be uncertain, The world deserved to see at least this much of his brother's vision made real. Roy himself would live only briefly past that park's opening in October of 1971, and with his passing, the full weight of interpreting Walt's remaining, unfinished dream fell to a new generation of executives, men who had spent years standing quietly at Walt's shoulder, absorbing his instincts, without ever having been asked to translate those instincts into decisions of their own. Card Walker and Don Tatum were, by temperament, cautious men, corporate men who had risen through the company not by dreaming aloud in the manner of Walt, but by managing budgets and schedules and shareholder expectations with a steady and unglamorous competence. It would be easy, looking back across the intervening decades, to imagine some dramatic confrontation in a boardroom, some clash between bold imagination and timid accounting. But the truth of what unfolded in the early 1970s was quieter than that, and in some ways sadder, though it was also in its own way wiser. Walker and Tatum inherited the blueprints and the scale models of Progress City, the vast circular metropolis with its climate-controlled dome and its layered transportation systems, and they studied them with genuine respect, and they arrived gradually at a conclusion that Walt himself, had he lived long enough to confront the same practical questions, might eventually have reached as well. A real city, populated by real residents, governed under experimental exemptions from ordinary building codes and electrical codes and fire codes, was not merely an architectural challenge, but a legal and political one. And the deeper the executives studied the question, the more clearly they saw the difficulties multiplying before them like corridors in a hall of mirrors. Who would serve as mayor of an American city owned entirely by a private corporation? Who would sit on its school board? And to what basis would that authority be traced? What would happen if a resident wished to organize a labor union inside a company town, or to sue their landlord, who was also, in this case, their employer, their utility provider, and quite possibly their childhood memory of a beloved family entertainment? Walt had always spoken of Progress City as a laboratory rather than an ordinary town, a place where new solutions could be tested continuously and never allowed to calcify into permanent policy, but a laboratory of that kind, populated by families raising children and building careers and growing old, was something without precedent in American law, and the executives who now bore responsibility for the company's future could not, in good conscience, gamble the entire enterprise on solving problems that had never been solved before. And so gradually, through many long meetings held in the same Burbank offices where Walt's sketches still hung upon the walls, a different vision began to take shape, one that preserved the geometry and the optimism and the deep architectural ambition of the original concept while releasing it from the impossible burden of functioning as an actual municipality. If EPCOT could not be a city where people lived, the thinking went, then perhaps it could be something else entirely, a permanent exposition, a fair that never closed its gates and never dismantled its pavilions, a place where the themes Walt had cared about most deeply, the celebration of human ingenuity and the wonder of cultures meeting one another across vast distances, could still find expression without requiring anyone to actually reside behind its ticket gates. This was not, in the minds of the men making this decision, a betrayal of Walt's dreams so much as a translation of it, a way of preserving its emotional core while discarding the elements that reality could not support. It is worth pausing here in the slow unfolding of this history, to notice the particular shape the new concept began to take, because it emerged not as a single unified idea, but as two distinct visions gradually drawn toward one another until they met, almost by architectural instinct, in the middle. On one side of this new plan stood what the designers began calling Future World, a landscape of soaring geometric pavilions arranged like planets orbiting a central sun, each one dedicated not to a single corporation's product line, but to an entire domain of human endeavor, energy and agriculture, and the sea, and the workings of the human imagination itself. Here the aesthetic Walt had always favored, the clean curves and gleaming surfaces of a hopeful technological future, would find its fullest and most concentrated expression, an entire district devoted to the idea that human beings, working together and applying themselves with patience and ingenuity, could continue to improve the conditions of their lives indefinitely. On the other side of this new plan, and this was the genuinely novel edition, the piece that had not existed in Walt's original conception of Progress City at all, stood what came to be called World Showcase, a landscape organized not around scientific themes, but around nations, each pavilion built to evoke, with careful and loving attention to architectural detail, the particular visual character of a country somewhere on the globe. This idea had grown out of Walt's own fascination with the international pavilions of the 1964 World's Fair in New York, where he had first collaborated with the government of several nations and corporations to build small, beloved recreations of foreign culture for American audiences who might never have the means or opportunity to travel abroad themselves. If Future World looked forward, imagining what humanity might yet build, World Showcase would look outward, celebrating what humanity had already built, the temples and canals and marketplaces and quiet village squares that had taken shape across centuries in lands separated by oceans. The architectural planning required to bring these two visions into being and to bring them into relationship with one another across a single unified piece of land, occupied the Imagineers for the better part of a decade. And the scale of the undertaking, even now, remains difficult to hold fully in the mind. The designers settled upon a great artificial lagoon as the unifying element of the entire park, a body of water excavated from a flat Florida terrain and shaped with the same deliberate geometry Walt had always favored, so that Future World's pavilions could rise along one curved shoreline, while World Showcase's pavilions arranged themselves around the remaining circumference. The whole composition readable, from certain elevated vantage points, as a single continuous gesture rather than two. Separate parks, awkwardly joined together, at the heart of Future World, replacing the vast glass dome that had once crowned Walt's original hub. The planners envisioned a colossal geodesic sphere, its triangulated steel structure rising some 18 stories above the ground, a shape borrowed from the architectural philosophy of Buckminster Fuller, whose belief that the sphere represented the most efficient possible structure for enclosing space had captivated engineers and dreamers alike throughout the middle decades of the century. Inside that great sphere, a slow-moving ride vehicle would carry guests upward and around a spiraling track, tracing the whole arc of human communication from the earliest cave paintings through the printing press and the telephone and onward toward a future still being imagined even as the ride itself was being designed, a journey meant to feel less like an amusement and more like a meditation on the very idea of progress. Surrounding this central sphere, the other pavilions of Future World took their own distinct geometric forms, each one a kind of architectural essay on its subject matter. The pavilion devoted to energy would eventually take the shape of a great tilted disk, appearing to float just above a reflecting pool, evoking the image of a solar collector angled to catch the sun. The pavilion devoted to the imagination would rest beneath a pair of glass pyramids, their faceted surfaces catching the light in ways that shifted throughout the day. Cool blue in the morning and warm gold as the Florida sun began its slow descent toward evening. Across the water, in World Showcase, the architectural vocabulary would change entirely, exchanging the clean abstraction of Future World's geometric forms for detailed and specific historical reference. A Moroccan pavilion built with the direct involvement of that nation's own craftsmen, its tile work assembled by hand according to techniques centuries old. A Japanese pavilion arranged around a 5-story pagoda modeled after a historic temple, its proportions studied and replicated with quiet reverence. A French pavilion evoking the mansard roofs and wrought iron of a Parisian streetscape, scaled down just enough to feel intimate rather than diminished. What becomes clear, walking slowly through the planning documents and early concept renderings that survive from his period, is that the Imagineers charged with this transformation were engaged in something far more delicate than simply filling empty acreage with attractions. They were attempting to reconcile two different registers of wonder. The wonder of looking forward into an unbuilt future, and the wonder of looking outward across a world already rich with achieved and inherited beauty. And they were attempting to do this without allowing either register to overwhelm or diminish the other. The lagoon itself became the quiet mediator of this reconciliation, its still surface reflecting, depending on where guest happened to stand, either the gleaming geometric abstraction of future world or the specific, textured architecture of a dozen different nations, so that a single unhurried walk around its perimeter became, in effect, a walk through the entire span of human aspiration, from the earliest agricultural terraces carved into distant hillsides to the most advanced dreams of what tomorrow's technology might yet accomplish. It was, in its finished form, a park built less like a story with a beginning and an end, and more like a great slow, rotating carousel of human achievement, one that a visitor could enter from any point and still find themselves, eventually, moving in a gentle and complete circle back toward where they had begun. The structure rose 180 feet into the Florida sky, a nearly perfect sphere held aloft on 6 enormous legs that met the ground with the quiet confidence of something that had always belonged there, as though the geometry of the sphere had simply grown upward out of the earth like some vast crystalline seed finally reaching its full and inevitable form. Its surface was clad entirely in triangular panels of alucobond, an aluminum composite material chosen specifically for the particular quality of its reflection, a soft, slightly matte shimmer rather than the harsh glare one might expect from ordinary polished metal, so that the sphere seemed to hold the morning light rather than simply bounce it away, gathering the color of the sky into its own surface and returning it changed, softened, dreamlike. Guests walking the pathways below found that the sphere's appearance shifted continuously depending on the angle from which they viewed it and the position of the sun overhead, appearing almost silver in the direct light of mid-morning, taking on a faint rose-colored warmth as the afternoon progressed. And by evening, once the interior lighting began to glow outward through carefully placed seams between the panels, the entire structure seemed to become luminous from within, as though some great, soft burning ember had been suspended above the park on its 6 slender legs, its curved surface catching the last of the daylight even as its interior light began to take over the work of illumination. The very shape of the sphere, and this was something the architects had considered with tremendous care, carried its own quiet argument about efficiency and strength, an argument borrowed from Buckminster Fuller's decades of thinking about how humanity might build structures that used the least possible material to enclose the greatest possible volume. A triangle, unlike a square or a rectangle, cannot be pushed out of shape without either bending or breaking one of its sides. And so a structure built entirely from interlocking triangles, a geodesic structure, achieves a strength disproportionate to the lightness of its frame, a lesson visible in the delicate lattice of white struts that guests could glimpse through the gaps between panels if they looked closely enough at the sphere's underside as they passed beneath it, moving slowly toward its entrance. To walk beneath Spaceship Earth and toward the surrounding plaza was to become gradually aware of the water that moved through this part of the park with the same unhurried, deliberate geometry as everything else around it. The fountains here did not leap and crash in the manner of a public square fountain built for spectacle. Instead, they emerged from long geometric channels and shallow basins arranged in careful symmetrical patterns, the water rising only a few gentle inches before falling back upon itself in a soft, continuous murmur, catching the sunlight in thin sheets that seemed, in certain moments, almost solid, almost like moving glass rather than water at all. Walking the curved pathways that threaded between these fountains, a guest could look outward across the great lagoon that Walt's successors had excavated at the heart of the park. Its still surface holding a second, inverted image of Spaceship Earth trembling gently with each small disturbance of wind, so that the sphere seemed to exist twice, once rising into the sky and once sinking, mirrored, into the quiet water below. From this central plaza, the pathways of future world fanned outward in the same deliberate radial pattern that had once organized the imagined neighborhoods of Progress City, each pavilion positioned like a planet, holding its own particular orbit around the shared gravitational center of the Great Sphere. To walk toward the land, situated along the western curve of this arrangement, was to approach a building unlike any other in the park, low and wide rather than tall, its roof line extending outward in a series of long, gently sloping planes that seemed, from certain angles, to evoke the rolling contour of cultivated farmland seen from a great distance. This impression was not accidental. The pavilion housed beneath its expansive roof the largest greenhouse complex most visitors had ever encountered, a series of interconnected growing rooms stretching across nearly 6 acres, their structure a careful lattice of glass and steel through which the Florida sunlight poured down onto experimental agricultural techniques, still being studied by researchers, even as guests glided past them on quiet boats. To board the boat ride that carried guests through these growing rooms was to drift slowly beneath towering trellises hung with tomato vines grown not in soil, but nutrient-rich water, their roots suspended and visible through clear channels, a technique the guide's gentle recorded narration explained as hydroponics, a method that might one day allow crops to be grown in places where ordinary soil could never support them. Deserts and polar research stations, and the narration suggested with quiet optimism, perhaps even distant space stations orbiting other worlds. Elsewhere within the same vast greenhouse, guests floated past squash vines climbing spiral trellises engineered to maximize the amount of fruit a single plant might produce within a limited footprint of space, and past experimental growing chambers where the very composition of the air itself was being adjusted and studied, all of it bathed in the warm, humid, faintly earthy atmosphere that greenhouses the world over seem to share, a smell of growing things and warm soil and condensation, gathering quietly on glass. From the land's low, sloping geometry, a guest walking the perimeter of future world eventually arrived at a pavilion whose architecture stood in almost complete contrast to everything encountered thus far, a building that seemed, even standing still, to be caught in the very act of motion. This was Horizons, and its exterior took the form of 2 great intersecting geometric volumes, their surfaces built from repeating diamond-shaped panels of glass and metal that caught the light in fractured shifting patterns, so that the building itself seemed to shimmer and pulse gently as clouds moved overhead, never quite settling into a single fixed appearance the way a more conventional structure might. Some visitors, describing the building to friends who had not yet visited, reached for the image of a great crystal formation, its facets multiplying and refracting the sunlight into countless small variations, while others saw in its swept, angular lines something closer to a spacecraft frozen at the moment just before launch, its structure straining gently upward and outward, as though gravity itself were only a temporary and negotiable condition. Inside, Horizons carried its guests through a ride experience unlike anything else in the park, one that moved not through a single narrative but through an entire panorama of possible futures, each one imagined with careful, loving specificity. Guests drifted past a vision of a desert reclaimed through careful irrigation and shaded agricultural domes, farmers tending crops beneath the same kind of climate-controlled canopy that Walt himself had once imagined stretching above the heart of Progress City. They drifted past a vision of undersea cities glowing softly beneath the dark pressure of the ocean depths, their inhabitants moving through corridors lit with the same soft, warm luminescence that characterized so much of the park's own architecture. They drifted past a vision of space colonies rotating slowly in orbit, their curved interior surfaces holding entire simulated landscapes, rivers and forests and small towns built along the inner wall of a great spinning cylinder. Gravity itself produced not by the pull of a planet, but by the patient physics of rotation. And in its final moments, the ride offered guests a choice, a branching path that allowed each vehicle to select among several possible endings: sky, sea, or space. A small but meaningful gesture toward the idea that the future was not a single fixed destination, but a landscape of genuine and open possibility, waiting for each individual to choose their own particular direction through it. To leave horizons and continue along the curve of Future World's perimeter was, for guests visiting in these opening years, to arrive eventually at a pavilion still gathering its final details, one that would not fully open until several years after this initial October morning, but whose eventual form was already beginning to take shape along the lagoon's northern edge. This was to become the Living Seas, and even in these early years, its architects were already speaking, in the careful language of concept renderings and early construction photographs, about a structure unlike anything the park had yet attempted. A building whose defining feature would not be visible from the outside at all, but would instead lie hidden beneath an artificial coral reef formation, a great tank holding some 6 million gallons of salt water, one of the largest man-made ocean environments ever constructed, populated eventually by sharks and rays and dolphins and countless smaller reef fish moving in slow, patient schools through waters kept in a state of permanent, carefully monitored clarity. When guests eventually descended into this pavilion, they would find themselves moving downward through a structure designed to evoke the sensation of sinking gently beneath the ocean surface, the light around them shifting gradually from the warm daylight of the entrance hall to the cooler, bluer tones associated with increasing depth, until they arrived finally at a research station built to appear as though it rested directly upon the ocean floor itself, its curved viewing windows offering an unbroken view into the great tank beyond, where shapes moved slowly through blue-green water lit from unseen sources above, the silhouettes of larger fish passing overhead in unhurried arcs, their shadows sliding gently across the sandy floor of the tank and across the faces of the guests standing quietly at the glass, watching, in the hushed and reverent manner that seems to overtake almost everyone who stands before a very large body of water and considers, if only for a moment, the vast and largely unseen world that continues beneath its surface regardless of whether anyone happens to be watching. Standing at the close of that opening day, as the Florida light began its slow transition from the gold of late afternoon into the deeper blue of early evening, and as the interior lighting of Spaceship Earth began to glow more visibly against the darkening sky, a guest walking back toward the entrance plaza might have paused, as so many did, to look back across the lagoon at the whole assembled geometry of the park, the sphere and its rippled reflection, the low-sloping greenhouse roofline of the land, the shimmering diamond facets of horizons catching the day's last light, and the quiet, still unfinished shoreline where the living seas would eventually take its place. It was, in that particular hour, difficult to say with any certainty what exactly this new kind of park represented, whether it was closer to an educational institution or an amusement park or something genuinely without precedent, a hybrid form still finding its own name. But it was not difficult, standing there in that fading golden light, to feel that something patient and considered and quietly ambitious had been built upon that reclaimed Florida land, something that asked its visitors not to hurry from one thrill to the next, but simply to walk, and to look, and to wonder, at the same slow and unhurried pace as the water moving gently through the fountains at their feet. There is a particular hour, familiar to anyone who has ever lingered in a beautiful place until the very end of the day, when the quality of light begins to change more quickly than the eye can quite follow, when the gold of late afternoon deepens by degrees into amber, and the amber softens further into the long lavender shadows that precede true evening. And it is in this hour, this slow and generous threshold between daylight and night, that the world showcase around EPCOT's Great Lagoon reveals itself most fully. Its 11 countries settling into their evening character the way a room settles into quiet once the last conversation has trailed off into comfortable silence. The lagoon itself measures some 1.25 miles around its full circumference, a distance that invites not urgency but particular, unhurried form of walking, the kind that has no true destination beyond the walking itself. And it is along this curving shoreline path that a visitor might spend the last hours of an EPCOT evening, moving slowly from nation to nation, as the sky overhead completes its long transition from blue to violet to the deep, star-scattered black of a Florida night. To begin this evening walk near the French Pavilion is to encounter almost immediately one of the most beloved illusions the Imagineers ever achieved within the park. A slender iron tower rising above the rooftops at roughly 1/10 the scale of its Parisian original, positioned with such careful attention to sight line and perspective that from certain vantage points along the promenade it appears, for a suspended and delightful moment, to loom at something closer to its true and towering height. As the sky behind it deepens into evening, small lights begin to trace the tower's lattice ironwork, tiny points of warm gold climbing along its crisscross beams, and the whole structure seems to lift slightly away from the darkening sky behind it, floating there above the mansard roof lines and the striped awnings of the small, recreated storefronts beneath, their windows glowing amber with the particular warmth of shop, lighting the world over. The kind of light that makes even an unfamiliar street feel briefly, gently like home, somewhere below the tower, along the narrow cobblestone lane built to evoke the passages of old Paris. The lagoon's water laps softly against a low stone embankment, and if a listener closes their eyes for just a moment, the combination of that lapping water and the distant, murmured conversation of other visitors moving unhurriedly along the same path becomes almost indistinguishable from an actual evening beside an actual river. The sane imagine so completely that the imagining itself becomes a kind of quiet, restful truth. Moving onward along the curve of the lagoon, the path leads a walker gradually away from the ornamented ironwork of France and into a landscape built upon an entirely different philosophy of beauty, one where ornamentation gives way almost entirely to restraint, and where restraint itself becomes the source of a very deep and settled peace. This is the Japan Pavilion, and its central structure, a 5-story pagoda modeled with careful reverence after a historic temple in Nara, rises in a series of gently overlapping roof planes, each one curving upward at its corners in the manner particular to traditional Japanese temple architecture, a shape that seems, even in stillness, to carry a kind of quiet lift, as though the building itself were exhaling slowly and evenly with each passing hour. As evening settles fully around this pagoda, soft lanterns begin to glow along the pathways leading toward it, their light low and warm and entirely without glare, illuminating just enough of the surrounding garden to reveal its careful, deliberate composition without ever overwhelming the darkness that gathers naturally beneath the trees. That garden itself deserves a slow and careful attention. because it represents, perhaps more purely than any other single space within the park, an entire philosophy translated directly into landscape. Raked gravel surrounds carefully placed stones in patterns meant to evoke, in the quiet visual language long practiced by Japanese garden designers, the movement of water without requiring any water to actually flow, the pale gravel catching what little light remains in the sky and holding it in soft, rippled lines. Nearby, actual water does move, gathered into a small and carefully engineered cascade that trickles from one stone basin into another with a sound so gentle and so continuous that it becomes, after only a few minutes of standing near it, almost impossible to distinguish from silence itself, a kind of sound that the ear stops actively hearing and instead simply absorbs, the way one absorbs the sound of one's own breathing. Bamboo stalks lean gently against one another along the garden's edges, their narrow leaves catching the faint evening breeze and producing a soft, papery whisper. And somewhere beneath all of these smaller sounds, the lagoon itself continues its own quiet rhythm against the nearby shore, so that standing within this garden at twilight becomes an exercise in listening to several very quiet things at once, each one distinct and yet each one blending into the others until the whole experience becomes a single continuous, softly layered hush. Continuing along the promenade, past the quiet transition of Morocco's intricately tiled courtyards, past the deep green awnings and the market stalls of a pavilion built with such careful attention to authentic craft that its very tile work was assembled by artisans brought from that country specifically to practice their inherited techniques upon Florida soil, a walker eventually arrives at a structure whose silhouette announces itself long before its details become clear. A stepped pyramid, rising against the darkening sky in the layered, terrace-style long associated with the great Mesoamerican civilizations of ancient Mexico. As the last blue light drains from the sky behind it, soft floodlighting begins to define the pyramid's stepped profile, warm amber light gathering along each terraced edge and casting long, gentle shadows across the stonework, so that the entire structure seems to hold within itself some quiet memory of firelight, of ceremonial torches once burning atop temples, built centuries before any visitor walking this promenade tonight had been born. Beneath that illuminated pyramid, guests find themselves drawn toward an entrance that leads not upward into the structure itself, but downward and inward, beneath its base, into a covered marketplace built to evoke, with the same careful attention to authentic detail found throughout World Showcase, a Mexican village square caught in the soft hours just after sunset. Here the lighting shifts again, becoming warmer still, strings of small bulbs strung between painted stalls selling pottery and woven textiles, their colors muted now in the low evening light to soft terracotta and faded indigo. And at the heart of his covered plaza, a small boat ride drifts gently along a dark, quiet waterway, carrying visitors past painted scenes of Mexican history and folklore, the boats moving with the same unhurried patience found in every corner of this park. There, gentle wake, the only disturbance upon otherwise still, dark water lit from below by soft, hidden lanterns. From this covered marketplace, a walker returning to the open evening air and continuing along the lagoon's edge eventually arrives at the largest single structure within all of World Showcase, a building whose architectural character stands in deliberate and thoughtful contrast to the specific national styles surrounding it, precisely because it represents not a single foreign nation, but the host country itself, gathered into a single grand and unifying statement. This is the American adventure, and its structure rises in the careful symmetrical brickwork of colonial-era American architecture. Its facade built from more than 100,000 handmade bricks, their surfaces left with a slight irregularity and warm reddish variation that only genuine handcraft can produce. Arranged beneath a white portico supported by tall, simple columns that evoke, without directly copying, the meeting halls and state houses of the nation's founding era. As evening deepens fully into night, warm light begins to glow from within the tall arched windows set along this brick facade, and soft floodlighting rises along the white columns of the portico, so that the entire building seems to hold itself with a quiet, settled dignity, neither as ornate as the pavilions of France or Morocco, nor as strikingly geometric as the great sphere of Spaceship Earth rising somewhere behind it across the water, but instead simply solid, simply patient, simply present. The way an old and well-built home settles quietly into a familiar landscape after many decades of standing in the same place. A wide reflecting pool stretches before the building's entrance, its still surface holding, once the last daylight has fully drained from the sky, a clear and steady mirror image of the brick facade and its glowing windows, doubled downward into the dark water, exactly as Spaceship Earth's own reflection had doubled itself in the central lagoon many hours and many pavilions earlier in the evening. Standing at this point along the promenade, having walked now nearly the full circumference of the great lagoon, a visitor gains, for the first time in the evening, a genuinely complete view back across the water toward everywhere they have already walked, the illuminated Tower of France glowing faintly gold in the distance, the soft lanterns of Japan's garden glimmering somewhere beyond it, the amber terraces of the Mexican pyramid rising against the deep blue-black of full night, and above, all of it rising from the far side of the water like some patient and watchful moon brought down close to the earth, the great luminous sphere of Spaceship Earth. Its Alucobond panels, now glowing with soft interior light rather than reflecting the sun that has long since set. The water of the lagoon holds every one of these lights at once, each pavilion's particular glow rippling gently outward and mingling with its neighbors upon the same dark, unbroken surface. French gold blending softly into Japanese lantern light, Mexican amber drifting into the deep white brilliance of the American adventure's reflecting pool. All of it gathered finally into a single continuous ribbon of color trembling quietly across the water. It is difficult, standing at the edge of that lagoon in the last hour before the park's evening finally closes, not to feel something settle gently within one's own chest, some quiet and wordless recognition that what has been built here, however artificial its origins, however carefully engineered every stone and every trickle of water and every string of lantern light, nonetheless succeeds in producing something genuinely true, a small and patient reminder that the many separate cultures, scattered across a vast and often divided world share, beneath their particular differences of language and architecture and custom, a common and abiding appreciation for beauty, for craft, for the quiet pleasure of walking beside still water as evening falls, and the first stars begin to appear overhead. The nations represented along this shoreline have not, in the wider world beyond this park's gates, always found their way easily toward harmony, and history holds within it more than enough evidence of conflict and misunderstanding between the very cultures gathered here so peacefully around a single reflecting lagoon. And yet here, in this carefully imagined evening, France and Japan and Mexico and America stand together in unbroken and undisturbed proximity, their lights mingling gently upon the same quiet water, asking nothing of one another beyond the simple. Patient company of shared beauty observed together in the same soft hour. And it is this quiet vision, more than any single pavilion or ride or architectural marvel, that a tired visitor carries with them as they turn at last away from the lagoon's edge, walking slowly back toward the waiting monorail, the lights of the showcase dimming gradually behind them, the water settling back into its own dark and undisturbed stillness, patient and unhurried, exactly as it will remain until the light returns again tomorrow, and the whole quiet, peaceful circle of nations begins once more to glow softly around its ancient, ever-patient lagoon.